They secure the port, and a few months later in September, their leader, Yusuf ibn Tashfin, arrives with an estimated 12,000 more of them. From Algeciras, they travel to Seville, where they link up with the armies of the Taifas, and then press onwards to the north. Alfonso VI, a man whose army has also been tested in battle, disengages from his siege of Zaragoza and moves in on the new threat from the Maghreb. On October 23, 1086, the two forces meet 5 miles northeast of Badajoz at a town known as Sagrajas. The two armies both deployed themselves into 2 lines on opposite sides of a river. Alfonso placed his mercenaries from Aragon in his first line and his larger Castilian forces into the second. Yusuf ibn Tashfin divided his soldiers into a first line which consisted of the various taifas, including the soldiers from Seville, and in his second line he placed his warriors from North Africa behind a protective ditch. The battle began as Alfonso sent in a powerful cavalry charge across the Guadiana River. The first wave of mercenaries from Aragon, under the command of his general, Alvar Fanez, smashed into the first line of the Muslim force, sending all of them except the forces of Seville under their ruler Al-Mutamid into full retreat. Fanez and his Aragonese cavalry chased after them, essentially leaving the field. King Alfonso, seeing the gap open up in front of him, ordered his main troops into a headlong attack on the Muslim second line, and managed to breach it. Yusuf, witnessing his line begin to crumble, ordered his Moroccan reserve forces, along with the troops from Seville, into a flanking attack on Alfonso. And then he sent his remaining cavalry into a charge past the Christian line and directly into their camp. When Alfonso saw his encampment under attack, he withdrew his forces back from the front line, taking them from an offensive to a defensive posture. This was going to prove to be a disastrous mistake. As the Castilian forces made their way back to their camp to set up a new line of defense, they took massive casualties from the flanking Moroccans and civilians, so much so that when Alvar Fanez returned from his hot pursuit, he saw the slaughter and, fearing the worst, abandoned the field. Seeing the departing Aragon cavalry, the Muslims launched a concerted counterattack which ripped open holes in the Castilian line. And at this point, Yusuf ordered his elite Black Guard into the cracks, and thus inflicted a crushing defeat on Alfonso. The exact details of this battle are not consistent, but it was hands down a victory for the Almoravids. The Christian camp got looted, Alfonso was wounded, and it was recorded that he managed to escape with only 500 of his knights, and this only under the cover of darkness. What is agreed upon, however, was that the casualties were heavy on both sides. The battle, known as Sagrajas to the Christians, was given a different name by the Moors. To them, this fight was known as Az-Zalika, which meant slippery ground. You see, there was so much carnage that the massive bloodshed soaked the ground, flooding it, making it so slick that the warriors on this field would slip as they fought. In the aftermath of this battle, Alfonso was no longer able to pursue his goals of conquest. He needed time to rebuild his army. Yusuf ibn Tashfin was in a similar situation. Indeed, the Almoravids were engaged on other fronts, and he had to return to the Maghreb as his son had been killed and revolts were popping up. And as would turn out, just as he and his Almoravids left the Iberian Peninsula, the Christian kingdoms once again reasserted themselves. The payment of parias came back, the Taifas began to fight amongst themselves, and Alfonso VI, sensing this confusion, pushed further south to capture the fortress of Aledo. In 1088, the quibbling Taifas once again asked for help. Ibn Tashfin returned dutifully with his forces, and the goal was now to retake Aledo. But this was going to be a disaster from the start. The Almoravids had never developed sufficient siege technology, and the Muslim mini-states couldn't keep it together politically. Some of this got to almost a ridiculous level. I mean, some of these taifas were still making alliances with the Christians. The siege failed, and Tashfin returned to North Africa. The man was frustrated with Al-Andalus, and rightfully so. Once again, the taifas had their backs to the ropes, but this didn't stop them from asking for help yet again. In the year 1090, Yusuf ibn Tashfin had an epiphany. He realized that the Taifa states were not only useless, but also irrelevant. Michael Berry, in his book, An Homage to Al-Andalus, comments, quote, "By now Ibn Tashfin had lost patience with his wayward co-religionists in Al-Andalus. Many of the Andalusi religious scholars had made representations to him requesting assistance while complaining about the situation, particularly the excessive taxes. As Ibn Tashfin decided to take over the errant land, care was taken to clothe this in some form of legitimacy in the Muslim world. It is said that a petition was sent to the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad to recognize Yusuf ibn Tashfin as Emir of Al-Andalus, and thus the Abbasid Caliph was willing to confer on the Almoravids the right to take over." End quote. And so, much like the lightning conquest of 711, the Almoravids returned and cut a swathe through the Taifa states. In 1090, they took Granada and Malaga and established a beachhead in the south. In 1091, they advanced north and took Córdoba, Murcia, Aledo, Lorca, and then moved on to Seville. The ruler, Al-Mutamid, the same man who was at the Battle of Sagrajas, was sent into exile, and Chris Lowney described how he went. Quote, "Al-Mutamid of Seville soon enough regretted inviting the Almoravid storm upon Iberia. Desperate to save his throne, he offered his widowed daughter-in-law, Zaida, to his one-time enemy Alfonso VI as a seal of a Muslim-Christian alliance against the Almoravid invaders." End quote. And just as a side note, Zaida bore Alfonso his only son, Sancho. The cat was out of the bag, so to speak. In 1094, Badajoz was conquered. Its ruler was not as lucky as Al-Mutamid. He was executed. Apparently, not only did he make an alliance with the Christians, but he also wanted to hand over almost all of his land to them. This rapid takeover was alarming to the Christian kingdoms in the north. But Alfonso didn't take this lying down. He sent in an army in 1097, which was demolished at the Battle of Consuegra, and another army in 1108, which was annihilated by the Almoravids at the Battle of Euclis. It was in this fight that Alfonso's only son, again Sancho, died. Now, even after the death of the Almoravid ruler, Yusuf ibn Tashfin in 1106, the conquest continued. Valencia in 1108, Zaragoza in 1110, the Balearic Islands in 1116, and on and on and on. The major opposition was Toledo, which was put to siege in 1109 but did not fall. Kennedy describes this well. Quote, and mind you, I'm paraphrasing a little here. Quote, "On August 14th, the Almoravids stormed the fortifications of Talavera on the Tagus to the east of Toledo. They then moved on to the city itself, the only Taifa capital to have fallen permanently to the Christians. The country to the north and south was ravaged, and the city itself was invested for a month. But the garrison, led by Alvar Fanez, held out. The Almoravid army was unable to breach the defenses of this superb natural fortress, and in the end retired. Once again, their inability in siege warfare was glaringly apparent." End quote. Now, the reasons why the Almoravids were so successful are debatable. Their forces were, after all, battle-worthy and field-tested, and they developed a means of combining various units into an effective fighting machine. But they also rode in on the philosophy of a just cause. They believed that their actions were righteous and that they were acting to correct injustice. However, most importantly, they had the platform of abolishing unlawful taxes. Remember this last point, while it made the Almoravids popular to the people of Al-Andalus, it would later come back to haunt them. Many of the Taifas posed no resistance and simply welcomed in the Almoravids, almost like liberators. Which, to me, begs the bigger question. When a nation is imperiled, should it trade its independence, its human rights, and its national identity simply for security? Now, the Almoravids were excellent on the offensive, but when it came to governing, this was a totally different matter. They set up a government, a ruling class, that was based entirely on nepotism. Kennedy again, quote, "The Almoravid government remained family government. Very few outsiders were assimilated into the elite. Not only were the Andalusi Muslims completely excluded from military power, but even among the Berbers, power was concentrated in the hands of the Lamtuna chiefs. This concentration of power persisted right to the end of the Almoravid state. This made the leadership remarkably homogeneous, but also very restricted. End quote. This government was basically held in place on the backbone of the military. Many of the prior Andalusi middle management was kept in place, but the Christians and the Jews were expelled from high office. You see, the Almoravids, while they brought back military power, they also brought their religious orthodoxy with them, and in this, there was no separation between church and state. The Christian kingdoms in the north had taken a 1-2 punch and were left reeling. Most of the taifas at this point were united under the Almoravids, and military expeditions against them were destroyed, just as I had mentioned at the battles of Sagrajas, Consuegra, and Euclis. But there was also a bright spot in all of this. Let's step back in time for a second. The year is 1043. Rodrigo Diez de Vivar was born to a minor nobleman near the city of Burgos in the kingdom of Castile-Leon. Some people think of him as a greedy, self-centered hired gun. España, Spain, has him down as a national hero. Granted, his actions were that of an opportunistic mercenary, but for me, I'm impressed with his abilities to get out of a tough spot. He's about as close to a Han Solo figure as you're gonna get. He grew up and became a soldier, first for King Ferdinand and later for his son King Sancho. In fact, the man was a maverick. He proved to be a formidable fighter, defeating his enemies in hand-to-hand combat, but he also turned out to be a cunning tactical genius. The Castilians gave him the title El Campeador, which meant outstanding warrior, and he lived up to his reputation. But as I previously mentioned, King Sancho was killed in 1072 and was succeeded by his brother, Alfonso VI, who rightfully didn't trust Rodrigo, but he kept him around anyway because of his military prowess. In approximately 1079-1080, the king sent Rodrigo to collect parias from Seville. The deal went south. Rodrigo ended up attacking the wrong people and then found himself exiled. He and his loyal band of warriors now traversed the land, looking for opportunity, usually finding it. And while they weren't able to do the Kessel Run in under 12 parsecs, they did manage to find gainful employment in Zaragoza, working now for a Muslim state. Once again, he did well in his new job, fighting against the enemies of the Taifa state, which included the Moors of the city of Lleida and the Christians of the developing Aragon. When the Almoravids steamrolled across Al-Andalus and gave everybody a black eye, Rodrigo Diez de Vivar, whose reputation for being able to get out of tough spots and win, was recalled back into the service of Alfonso VI. Seeing this as a chance for self-advancement and massive personal gain, he took the king up on his offer and took the fight to the Almoravids. How do we say this nicely? Due to his colorful background, he had established some good contacts, and thus had the support of both Christians and Muslims alike against the invaders from North Africa. While the rest of the Christian kingdoms were getting beat down, Rodrigo was winning fights. And in 1094, he managed to slip in and take the city of Valencia. This was not taken kindly by Yusuf ibn Tashfin, who routed a massive Almoravid army to capture the city. In late 1094, Rodrigo and his men looked up beyond the battlements of Valencia and saw themselves surrounded and vastly outnumbered. There were siege towers as far as the eye could see. But if history teaches us anything, you never tell a man like this the odds. Rodrigo came up with a daring plan. He knew that October was a time period when the rains came in a massive deluge with rampant flooding. He also knew that October was going to be Ramadan for his opponent. And for those of you not familiar with Ramadan, it's a sacred religious time for the Muslims when they fast from dawn to dusk for an entire lunar cycle. He knew that they wouldn't attack during this time and that they would not exactly be at their peak efficiency at the end of a month of fasting. So he sent out his spies to the Almoravid line and convinced the North Africans to set up their main camp in a small town just to the northwest known as Cuarte. It was a lush farmland and it appeared like it was the ideal spot. But this was a land that was sandwiched between the Guadalaviar and the Turia rivers, not exactly the best spot when the rains came. In the very early morning of October 21st, Rodrigo heard a host of birds suddenly migrating, and he knew that the massive downpour was just behind them. Under the cover of darkness, he divided his heavily armed knights into 2 wings. His plan was to catch the enemy before they had time to commit their formations to any attack. His men went out secretly from the fortifications of Valencia and began to pitch hay under the siege towers, and then promptly lit them on fire. Rodrigo then gave the command for his first wing to attack. The stunned Almoravids had little time to react. Waking up tired and weary and hungry, they had barely time to realize that Rodrigo and his men were bearing down on them in a full, heavy cavalry charge. It was said that the hooves pounding the earth made a deafening noise. This charge destroyed and blasted through their line, but just as they were finally able to get up and chase after the knights, mind you now with their backs to Valencia, Rodrigo's second wing came out of the castle and trampled anybody in their path. Some of the Almoravids didn't even know what hit them. The carefully laid out siege now became a scene of chaos, strewn with dead bodies, disorganized formations running for their lives, and siege towers burning into the ground. But this wasn't even the main target of Rodrigo's attack. He quickly regrouped his men and headed off at full gallop to the main Almoravid camp at Cuarte. As he rode, it began to rain, and very quickly the rain became a storm. When he got to his destination, the Turia River had become a massive torrent, which in a normal time might have been a mild problem, but not a catastrophe. They did have, after all, irrigation canals and whatnot that could absorb the extra flow. But prior to all this, Rodrigo had made it a point to sabotage all the water gates and the irrigation weirs. The enemy camp was thus hit by a wall of water. The surging downpour washed away supplies, tents, wagons, and of course, Almoravids. Those that survived the downpour got bogged down in a swamp of mud that their camp had suddenly become. For Rodrigo and his men, this was no longer a fight, but a mop-up operation. Valencia would stay in Christian hands for the time being and remained a multi-ethnic city. It was finally taken 14 years later in 1108. But our enigmatic rogue/hero, depending on how you interpret his character, was not there to see it. In 1099, the same year the First Crusade took Jerusalem, Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar died. While he was known to the Christians as El Campeador, again meaning outstanding warrior, he was known to the Muslims as Al-Sayyid, meaning the Lord or the Master, and thus from Al-Sayyid, we get the name that he's known to history as, El Cid. To this day, he's a national icon in Spain. El Cid, like some of his warrior predecessors, set a precedence that the Christian states could now rally behind. Now, while the Almoravids were able to retake most of Al-Andalus and destroy entire armies sent from the Christian kingdoms in the north, they were unable to recapture any Christian lands. And as we've seen, they were unable to take the city of Toledo. In 1112, they were able to raid the city of Huesca, which would become the capital of the nascent kingdom of Aragon. Now mark this year 1112, because you see, this would be the last time a Muslim army would ever reach the foothills of the Pyrenees. I'd have to say that the Almoravids were beginning to lose their edge, and Chris Lowney explains part of the reason why. Quote, illiterate tribesmen a generation or so removed from the lifeless Sahara, the Almoravids now found themselves the stewards of medieval Europe's most splendid palaces and cities. But they differed in one critical respect from the stereotypical country yokel. They were steeled by the unflinching zeal of the reformer and brandished the military fury to implement their will. Yet before they got around to reforming spiritually lax Al-Andalus, they themselves succumbed to its pleasures, cultivating the same refined Andalusian lifestyle that once disgusted them. As their reforming zeal waned, so did Muslim hopes of reversing the Christian tide. End quote. The time period that was leading up to the 1150s saw a reemergence of the power of the Christian kingdoms. The Almoravids, on the other hand, would face a rapid decline both internally and externally. Professor Hugh Kennedy gets into this. Quote, Almoravid rule in Al-Andalus lasted barely a generation. Like other nomadic empires, it began to decline as soon as expansion had come to an end. From 1118 onwards, a new generation of Christian leaders from new and expanding kingdoms began to push their frontiers southward at the expense of the faltering Almoravid government. End quote. In the east, the kingdom of Aragon would begin to grow under its king, Alfonso I. And sorry, people, there's a ton of Alfonsos out there because, of course, that's just how history is sometimes. Alfonso I of Aragon was known as the Bateador, the battler. He retook Zaragoza in 1118 and secured the Ebro Valley a few years later. This man would even go so far as to crush an Almoravid army at the Battle of Cutanda in 1120. In the north, our dear Alfonso VI of Castile-Leon died in 1109 without a male heir. His only son Sancho, as I'd mentioned before, was killed in battle against the Moors the year before his death. But Castile was able to regroup and began to advance south once again. And in the western portion of the Iberian Peninsula, starting in approximately 1128, Portugal would begin to coalesce. Its king gained the assistance of Latin crusaders who helped him take Lisbon in 1147. So the strategic situation was such that you had three powerful kingdoms all coming into play, all of them with a baptism by fire, and all wanting to take a chunk out of Al-Andalus. And of course, keep in mind that this was the time when the crusading movement had been inaugurated. It was in 1095, after all, that Pope Urban II had called for an armed pilgrimage to retake Jerusalem. It had become the state policy of the Christian Church to wage war on the Saracens, and I guess the logic was, if you're going to do it on one end of the Mediterranean, you might as well do it on the other. The stage was now turning against the Almoravids, and the Andalusi, the people of the former Taifa states, looked on in disbelief. They, after all, had to give up their freedoms to accept a more rigid adherence to Islam. But they weren't the only ones to chafe under Almoravid rule. There were persecutions of both the Christians and the Jews who were living in these lands. One of the main reasons that the Andalusi had brought these, quote, backwater people into their land was to secure the border. And now they were failing in that duty. Instead, the North Africans were enjoying the food, the palaces, the wine, the music, all the things that they once sneered at. Yes, granted, it was nice that the taxes were so low and that they didn't have to pay any parias, but what good is that if the Christian kingdoms were going to take over? The Andalusi turned against the Almoravids with a vengeance. Uprisings occurred all over the place. In 1121, there was a major revolt in Córdoba that was savagely put down. With each new territory lost, defeat in battle, and city taken by the Christian kingdoms, the animosity only grew. The alienation of the local Christians and Jews only made things worse. But then things for the Almoravids got really bad. Back in Morocco, a rival group began to rise in opposition. They were known as the Almohads, and these guys had an even stricter view of Islam. They saw how the Almoravids had succumbed to the earthly pleasures of Al-Andalus, and saw their downfall as one of the necessary steps to bring back order. Michael Berry puts this very eloquently, quote, "Many fundamentalistic religious or political movements face a problem. The maintenance of fundamentalism is difficult. Pure rigor ends up being adulterated by compromises and temptations that arise when power is achieved. As the pattern of life in society becomes more relaxed, there is a danger that a new preacher or leader displeased with the relaxation of morals or principles emerges from the wings to begin cleansing afresh." And so it was with the Almohads, who emerged to deal with, amongst other things, the slippage of morals represented by the Almoravid rulers. End quote. The leader of this new movement, Muhammad ibn Tumart of the Masmuda tribe, began to launch attacks from his strongholds in the high Atlas Mountains. In 1140, his forces were able to take the city of Sijil Masa, and thus took away the lucrative gold trade routes. As I had mentioned before, the Almoravids rallied on the principle of not raising any unlawful taxes. Now that principle was a straitjacket that prevented them from bringing in the funds to field the armies needed to control their far-flung empire. Uprisings started to occur at a furious pace, and then in 1147, an Almohad army stormed Marrakesh and then systematically massacred the Almoravid high command. By the next year, the port cities of Ceuta and Tangier were in Almohad hands, effectively kicking the Almoravids out of North Africa. Ironically, the Almoravids were able to persist in Al-Andalus for a little longer. but massive uprisings from the Andalus Sea eventually destroyed them. The people of Al-Andalus were able to regain some semblance of their former independence, and a second Taifa state period began. However, the armies of the Almohad were in a heightened state of readiness. They were infused with an even more religious sense of righteousness. And perhaps even more importantly, they were just on the other side of the Strait of Gibraltar, and they were coming.